sterile silence of the Naval Medical Bay, Admiral Harrison Matthews had seen countless wounds of war, bullet holes, shrapnel tears, burns that painted stories of courage across human skin. But nothing had prepared him for what Lieutenant Sarah Chen would reveal when she lifted her uniform shirt that October morning. The scars that decorated her ribcage told a story that would shake the very foundations of everything he believed about honor, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving one's country. What began as a routine medical examination would become a confession that exposed a web of secrets spanning 3 decades, involving foreign operatives, a cover-up that reached the highest levels of government, and a woman whose body bore the evidence of a truth so dangerous that powerful people had tried to bury it along with her. The morning fog hung thick over Naval Base San Diego as Admiral Harrison Matthews walked briskly toward the medical facility. At 58, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had spent 4 decades in service to his country. His graying hair was cut military short, and his steel blue eyes missed nothing as they swept the base grounds. Today was supposed to be routine, a simple review of personnel medical files, nothing more than administrative duty that came with his position as base commander. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood outside the medical bay, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military bearing. At 32, she was one of the youngest officers to achieve her rank, with commendations that read like a catalogue of exemplary service. Her black hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her dark eyes held a depth that suggested she had seen more than most people twice her age. She had requested this meeting 3 days ago, citing concerns about her medical records that needed the Admiral's personal attention. Matthews approached with measured steps, noting the slight tension in Chen's shoulders that suggested this was far from routine. In his experience, when decorated officers requested private meetings about medical issues, it usually meant complications that could affect their careers. He had prepared himself for discussions about PTSD, combat injuries, or fitness for duty evaluations. What he was not prepared for was the story that would unfold over the next hour. The medical bay was empty except for the duty nurse, who excused herself at Matthew's gesture. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the sterile white walls. Medical equipment hummed quietly in the background, and the smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a chemical curtain between the present moment and whatever revelations were to come. Chen stood at attention until Matthews gestured for her to relax. Even then, her posture remained rigid, as if the weight of what she carried required perfect military bearing to contain. Her personnel file lay open on the examination table, thick with commendations, deployment records, and medical reports that painted the picture of an exemplary naval officer. But Matthews sensed there were pages missing from this story, chapters that existed only in the scars hidden beneath her uniform. The Admiral had reviewed her file the night before, noting the gaps that seemed insignificant at first glance but became more troubling upon closer examination. A 3-month medical leave early in her career with vague explanations. Psychological evaluations that seemed overly frequent for someone with no recorded combat trauma. Letters of recommendation that were enthusiastic but strangely lacking in specific details about certain operations she had been involved in. Chen's eyes met his, and in that moment Matthew saw something that made his stomach tighten with foreboding. It was the look of someone carrying a secret so heavy it had begun to crush them from the inside. He had seen that look in the mirror during his own darkest moments, when the weight of classified knowledge threatened to overwhelm even the strongest sense of duty and honor. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Outside, the sounds of base life continued. Marines drilling on the parade ground, helicopters coming and going from the flight line, the distant sound of ships' horns from the harbor. But inside this room, time seemed suspended, waiting for whatever Chen was about to reveal. She began to speak, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The story she told started 20 years ago, when she was just 12 years old, and her father, Captain David Chen, was stationed at a forward operating base in Southeast Asia. What happened to her family during those months would set in motion a chain of events that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon, involving foreign intelligence services, cover-ups that violated every principle of military justice, and a conspiracy that had been festering like an infected wound for 2 decades. Her father had discovered something during his deployment, Chen explained. Financial irregularities that suggested American military equipment was being diverted to unauthorized recipients. When he began asking questions, he was told to drop the investigation. When he persisted, he was transferred to a remote outpost. When he continued to push for answers, his family became targets. The first attempt on her life came during what was supposed to be a routine medical appointment at the base hospital. Chen was just a child, accompanying her mother for a checkup when armed men in civilian clothes entered the waiting room. Her mother pushed her under a chair and told her to stay hidden no matter what she heard. The sounds that followed would haunt Chen's dreams for the next 20 years. Gunshots, screaming, her mother's voice calling her name. Then, silence. When base security arrived, they found young Sarah Chen unconscious and bleeding, 3 bullet wounds in her chest and abdomen. The official report listed it as a terrorist attack, random violence that unfortunately caught American civilians in the crossfire. But Chen remembered details that didn't match the official story. The attackers had spoken English with American accents. They had called her by name. They had known exactly where to find her family. She survived because a Navy corpsman named Rodriguez disobeyed orders and rushed her to surgery instead of waiting for the official response team. Years later, she would learn that Rodriguez died in a vehicle accident 2 weeks after her surgery, an accident that investigators would later determine was anything but accidental. The surgeon who operated on her, Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, was transferred to a remote assignment in Alaska the next month and died of an apparent heart attack 6 months later, despite being only 42 years old with no history of cardiac problems. Chen's father was killed in action 3 days after the attack on his family. The official report stated that Captain David Chen died heroically defending his outpost against enemy forces. But Chen had obtained copies of the incident reports through unofficial channels years later, and they told a different story. There were no enemy forces. David Chen had been shot by friendly fire during what the reports described as a training accident. The soldiers involved were transferred to different units within days, and the investigation was classified at the highest levels. For the next 15 years, Chen lived with foster families, moving frequently as various attempts were made on her life. Car accidents that weren't accidents, house fires that started in suspicious circumstances, food poisoning that nearly killed her at age 16. Each time she survived through a combination of luck, the vigilance of her protectors, and an iron will inherited from parents who had died trying to expose the truth. She joined the Navy at 18, partly out of genuine patriotism, and partly because she believed that serving honorably might somehow balance the scales for her parents' deaths, but also because she knew that military service would give her access to information and resources she would need to eventually uncover the truth about what her father had discovered and why her family had been marked for death. The scars on her ribs were not from combat, Chen explained to Admiral Matthews. They were from the first attempt to kill her when she was 12 years old. But they were also from the most recent attempt, just 6 months ago, when she had finally gotten close enough to the truth to make certain people very nervous. Someone had broken into her apartment and left her for dead, but not before carving additional marks into the same area where she had been wounded as a child. It was a message, a reminder that no amount of time or distance would protect her from the consequences of asking the wrong questions. Admiral Matthews listened in growing horror as Chen detailed 20 years of survival, of living under assumed identities, of carefully building her naval career, while simultaneously conducting her own investigation into the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. She had become an expert in intelligence gathering, languages, and covert operations, not because it was her assigned specialty, but because these skills were necessary for staying alive long enough to find the truth. The medical records in her file were incomplete, Chen revealed, because the full documentation of her injuries would have raised questions that certain people in positions of power were not prepared to answer. Her psychological evaluations were frequent because military psychiatrists were trying to determine whether she posed a security risk, whether the trauma of her childhood had made her unsuitable for continued service, or worse, whether she might become a liability who would eventually expose secrets that were supposed to remain buried forever. As Chen spoke, Matthews found himself remembering fragments of conversations, classified briefings, and administrative decisions from his own career that suddenly took on new and troubling significance.
Operations that had been terminated without explanation.
Personnel transfers that had seemed random at the time. Budget allocations for programs that never seemed to produce any concrete results. The patterns had been there all along, but he had never connected them, because he had never imagined that such a conspiracy could exist within the institution he had devoted his life to serving. The afternoon light was fading as Chen finished the first part of her story. The medical bay had grown dim, and the shadows seemed to press closer around them. Admiral Matthews sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what he had just heard. If even half of what Chen was telling him was true, it meant that his own government had been systematically murdering American citizens to cover up crimes that reached into the highest levels of the military hierarchy. But Chen was not finished. She reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a thick manila folder, sealed with evidence tape that bore the signatures of 3 different witnesses. The documents inside, she explained, contained 20 years of painstaking investigation, financial records, communication intercepts, witness statements, and physical evidence that proved beyond any doubt that her family had been murdered to silence her father's investigation into a conspiracy that was still active today. Admiral Matthews stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive device. Once he opened it and read its contents, there would be no going back. His entire understanding of the institution he had served faithfully for 40 years would be shattered. But Chen's eyes held his steadily, and he realized that she was offering him something far more precious than his peace of mind. She was offering him the chance to choose honor over comfort, truth over the willful blindness that had allowed such horrors to continue for 2 decades. The weight of decision settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Outside, the base continued its daily routines, unaware that in this small medical bay, 2 officers were about to cross a line that would change everything. Chen waited patiently, her scarred hands steady as she held the folder that contained enough evidence to bring down some of the most powerful people in the American military establishment. Matthews reached for the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the evidence tape. In that moment, he understood that his real test as an officer was just beginning. Everything he had done before this moment had been preparation for the choice he was about to make. The choice between protecting the institution he loved and protecting the truth that institution was supposed to serve. Admiral Matthews broke the evidence seal with steady hands, though his heart was racing. The first document in Chen's folder was a photograph of her father, Captain David Chen, taken just days before his death. He was standing in front of a cargo container at the forward operating base, pointing to shipping manifests in his hands. His expression was troubled, the look of a man who had discovered something that would cost him everything. The shipping record showed discrepancies that should have triggered immediate investigations. Military-grade weapons and communication equipment were being diverted from their intended destinations and shipped to locations that didn't appear on any official maps. The serial numbers had been partially altered, but Captain Chen had been skilled enough to trace the original codes back to their sources. What he found was a network of unauthorized arms sales that generated millions of dollars in untraceable revenue. Chen explained that her father had initially brought his concerns to his immediate superior, Colonel James Morrison. Morrison had thanked him for his vigilance and promised to look into the matter personally. But instead of investigating, Morrison had contacted the very people who were profiting from the illegal arms trade. Within hours, Captain Chen went from being a decorated officer doing his duty to being a marked man whose entire family was in mortal danger. The next document was a medical report from the base hospital, where 12-year-old Sarah Chen had been treated after the attack. The official version listed her injuries as superficial wounds from flying debris during a terrorist incident. But the actual medical notes, which had been carefully hidden away by the treating physician, told a different story. The bullet wounds were precise, professional, the work of someone trained in tactical shooting. The angles suggested that the gunman had deliberately aimed to wound rather than kill, as if someone wanted her to survive as a witness to what happened to families who asked too many questions. Admiral Matthews studied the medical diagrams with growing revulsion. The shooter had carved symbols into the child's ribs while she was unconscious, marks that appeared random to anyone who didn't understand their significance. But Chen had spent years learning to decode those symbols, and what she discovered was a signature used by a private military contractor called Blackwater Securities, a company that officially didn't exist but had been conducting unauthorized operations for certain elements within the Pentagon since the early 1990s. The folder contained financial records showing payments from Blackwater Securities to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands, accounts that were linked to high-ranking military officers and Defense Department officials. The amounts were staggering, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars over 2 decades. This wasn't just corruption. It was systematic looting of military resources on a scale that threatened national security itself. Chen had spent 15 years infiltrating this network, using her military career as cover while she gathered evidence. She had volunteered for dangerous assignments not out of patriotism alone, but because these missions gave her access to classified communications and financial records that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Every commendation in her file represented a step closer to the truth, but also increased the danger to her life. The attempt on her life 6 months earlier had been triggered by her discovery of the current phase of the operation. Blackwater Securities had evolved beyond simple arms trafficking. They were now involved in what the documents described as population management protocols, in regions where American interests conflicted with local governments. The scars on her ribs had been reopened during the attack, and new symbols had been carved alongside the old ones, a message that her childhood survival had been a temporary reprieve, not a permanent escape. Matthews turned to the next section of evidence, which contained surveillance photographs taken by Chen herself over the past 5 years. The images showed secret meetings between uniformed military officers and men in civilian clothes who carried themselves like professional soldiers. License plates, faces, locations, and dates were meticulously documented. Chen had risked everything to gather this evidence, often conducting surveillance during her off-duty hours while maintaining the facade of a normal military career. One photograph showed Colonel Morrison, now a general, meeting with a man identified in Chen's notes as Viktor Petrov, a former Russian intelligence officer who had reportedly died in a car bombing in Moscow 10 years earlier. But here he was, very much alive, exchanging briefcases with an American general in a parking garage in Virginia. The implications were staggering. If Petrov was alive and working with American military officials, it meant the entire narrative about his death and the intelligence operations connected to it had been fabricated. The financial trail led to a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that stretched across multiple continents. Money flowed from Pentagon contracts to private military companies, then to arms dealers, then to foreign intelligence services, and finally back to American officials through a laundering scheme so complex it had taken Chen years to unravel. The amounts involved were large enough to fund small wars, which is exactly what they had been doing. Chen's investigation had revealed that Blackwater Securities was operating as a shadow military force, conducting unauthorized operations in at least 12 countries. They were assassinating political leaders, destabilizing governments, and creating the very conflicts that justified increased American military spending. It was a perfect closed loop that generated enormous profits while creating the illusion of national security threats that required constant military intervention. The most damning evidence was a series of communication intercepts that Chen had obtained through her work in naval intelligence. These weren't official military communications, but private messages between the conspirators discussing their operations with casual brutality. They talked about eliminating witnesses, manipulating intelligence reports, and coordinating with foreign agents as if these were routine business matters rather than acts of treason. One intercept showed Morrison giving orders to eliminate Chen's entire family 20 years ago, not because Captain Chen posed an immediate threat, but because they needed to send a message to other military personnel who might be tempted to ask inconvenient questions. The attack on 12-year-old Sarah Chen had been part of a broader campaign of intimidation designed to maintain silence through fear. Admiral Matthews read each document with increasing horror, but also with a growing sense of pieces falling into place. Decisions he had been ordered to make during his own career suddenly made sense in this context. Personnel transfers that had seemed arbitrary at the time were revealed as moves to protect the conspiracy. Budget allocations he had questioned but ultimately approved had funded operations that violated every principle of military ethics. Chen showed him copies of his own signatures on documents authorizing expenses for programs that he now realized had been fronts for Blackwater Securities operations. The conspirators had been using him and other high-ranking officers as unwitting accomplices, carefully manipulating the administrative machinery of the military to provide cover for their crimes. The folder contained witness statements from other military personnel who had discovered parts of the conspiracy over the years. Most had been silenced through threats or transfers to remote assignments. Some had died in accidents that the evidence suggested were carefully orchestrated murders, but a few had survived and were willing to testify if they could be guaranteed protection from the people who had been hunting them for years. Chen revealed that she had been in contact with FBI agents and federal prosecutors who were building a case against the conspiracy, but they needed someone with Admiral Matthews' authority and access to provide corroborating evidence from within the military hierarchy. The investigation had to be conducted in absolute secrecy because the conspirators had supporters and informants throughout the government, including within law enforcement agencies. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. These people had been operating for decades with virtual impunity, using the resources and authority of the United States military to enrich themselves while betraying the very country they had sworn to serve. They had murdered American citizens, including children, to protect their profits. They had destabilized foreign governments and created international crises to justify their existence. Admiral Matthews looked up from the documents to find Chen watching him with eyes that held both hope and resignation. She had spent half her life gathering this evidence, surviving multiple attempts on her life, and carefully building a case that could bring justice for her murdered parents and the countless other victims of this conspiracy. But she also knew that presenting this evidence was tantamount to signing her own death warrant. The weight of decision pressed down on Matthews like a physical force. He understood now why Chen had requested this private meeting, why she had chosen him specifically to share this information. His position as base commander gave him access to administrative records and communication channels that could provide the missing pieces of evidence needed to make the case airtight. But accepting this responsibility would also mean accepting the risk that came with it. Chen explained that the recent attempt on her life had been more than just an assassination attempt. Her attackers had been searching for copies of these documents, which she had hidden in multiple locations, using security protocols learned during her intelligence training. They had carved the additional symbols into her ribs as a form of interrogation, trying to force her to reveal the locations of her evidence caches. When she refused to break, they had left her for dead, apparently believing that the blood loss would finish what their knives had started. But Chen had survived, as she had survived every previous attempt on her life. She had dragged herself to a secure communication point and transmitted copies of her most crucial evidence to trusted contacts before seeking medical attention. The official medical report of that incident, which was part of her naval record, listed her injuries as the result of a civilian mugging that had gone wrong. But the truth was far more sinister. The attackers had been professional operatives, almost certainly sent by the same people who had murdered her parents 20 years earlier. They knew details about her investigation that could only have come from someone with access to classified military communications. This meant the conspiracy had informants within the intelligence services, people who were monitoring Chen's activities and reporting back to her enemies. Admiral Matthews closed the folder and looked at Chen with new understanding. This young woman had been living with a target on her back for 2 decades, using her military service as both a shield and a weapon in her quest for justice. Every day she served was a risk, but also an opportunity to gather more evidence against the people who had destroyed her family. Her dedication to duty wasn't just patriotism, it was survival. The silence in the medical bay was profound, as both officers contemplated the magnitude of what had been revealed. Outside, the base continued its routine operations, but inside this room, they both understood that nothing would ever be the same. The evidence in Chen's folder was enough to bring down some of the most powerful people in the American military establishment, but presenting it would require courage that transcended normal concepts of duty and honor. Chen reached for her uniform jacket and began to lift it, preparing to show Admiral Matthews the physical evidence that had been carved into her body. The scars on her ribs weren't just wounds. They were a map of the conspiracy, symbols that connected her childhood trauma to the ongoing threat against her life. They were also proof that the people responsible for this conspiracy saw human beings as expendable resources in their pursuit of profit and power. Admiral Matthews braced himself for what he was about to see, understanding that once Chen showed him those scars, there would be no possibility of pretending ignorance. The evidence would be literally written in flesh, a testament to the brutality of the people they were now committed to stopping. The next phase of their conversation would determine whether justice could finally be achieved, or whether the conspiracy would claim 2 more victims in its decades-long campaign of murder and intimidation. Lieutenant Chen lifted her uniform shirt with steady hands, revealing a map of violence etched into human flesh. Admiral Matthews had seen combat wounds, surgical scars, and the aftermath of explosions, but nothing had prepared him for the deliberate artistry of cruelty displayed across Chen's ribcage. The original scars from her childhood were pale silver lines that formed what appeared to be random marks, but overlaid upon them were darker, more recent scars that revealed a pattern so precise it could only have been intentional. The symbols carved into her skin formed a coordinate system, Matthews realized with horror. Each mark corresponded to a specific location, date, and operation code that Chen had decoded through years of painstaking research. Her attackers hadn't just been trying to kill her, they had been using her body as a filing system, recording their crimes in flesh that they assumed would never be seen by anyone who could understand the significance. Chen pointed to a cluster of marks near her lower ribs, explaining that these corresponded to arms shipments that had been diverted to rebel groups in South America. The dates matched Pentagon records of equipment that had been reported as destroyed in training accidents, but which had actually been sold to the highest bidders through Blackwater Securities Network. Each symbol represented millions of dollars in illegal transactions and countless deaths from weapons that were supposed to be defending American interests. Admiral Matthews leaned closer to examine the markings, noting the precision with which they had been executed. This wasn't the work of sadistic thugs. It was the systematic documentation of criminal operations by people who understood that traditional record-keeping could be discovered and used as evidence. They had turned Chen's body into a living ledger of their crimes, assuming that she would die before anyone could read the story written in her scars. But Chen had not only survived, she had learned to read the language of her own torture. Years of research in military cryptography and intelligence analysis had given her the skills to decode the symbols, and what she discovered was a complete record of Blackwater Securities operations dating back to the murder of her parents. Every major arms deal, every assassination, every act of international sabotage had been recorded in the scars that covered her ribs. The fresh scars from 6 months ago told the story of the conspiracy's current operations. Chen traced the newer marks with her finger, explaining that they represented a massive arms shipment that was scheduled to be diverted from a military base in Germany to unknown recipients in Eastern Europe. The operation was worth over $50 million and would put advanced American military technology in the hands of foreign intelligence services. Matthews felt his hands begin to shake as the implications sank in. These weren't just financial crimes. They were acts of treason that threatened national security on a scale that could destabilize entire regions. The weapons being sold through these illegal channels were ending up in the hands of America's enemies, creating the very threats that justified increased military spending and expanded operations. Chen lowered her shirt and reached for another document from her folder, a detailed analysis of the symbols and their meanings that she had compiled over years of investigation. Each mark corresponded to entries in classified Pentagon databases, budget allocations, and personnel assignments. The pattern revealed a conspiracy that had tentacles reaching into every branch of the military and several civilian agencies. The document showed that General Morrison, Chen's father's former superior, was at the center of a network that included at least 12 high-ranking officers, 6 defense contractors, and an unknown number of foreign operatives. The financial flowcharts looked like the organizational structure of a major corporation, with clear hierarchies, profit-sharing arrangements, and operational territories divided among the conspirators. Admiral Matthews studied the organizational chart with growing alarm. Several of the names were people he knew personally, officers he had served alongside, and considered friends. The revelation that they had been part of a criminal conspiracy for decades forced him to re-evaluate every interaction, every decision, every moment of trust he had shared with these individuals. Chen explained that the conspiracy had been recruiting new members through a careful screening process that identified officers with gambling debts, family problems, or other vulnerabilities that could be exploited. They offered financial assistance and career advancement in exchange for small favors that gradually escalated into more serious compromises. By the time their targets realized they were part of a criminal organization, they were too deeply implicated to withdraw safely. The recruitment process was documented in intercepted communications that Chen had obtained through her intelligence work. The conspirators discussed potential targets with the casual efficiency of corporate headhunters, evaluating officers' psychological profiles, financial situations, and access to sensitive information. They had turned military service into a shopping mall for traitors, systematically corrupting the institution from within. One intercepted message showed Morrison discussing Admiral Matthews himself as a potential recruit, noting his access to base resources and his reputation for following orders without asking unnecessary questions. The plan had been to gradually involve him in administrative decisions that would provide cover for their operations, using his authority and reputation to legitimize their activities. Matthews felt sick as he read the assessment of his own character, realizing how close he had come to being drawn into the conspiracy through his own sense of duty and institutional loyalty. The conspirators had identified these virtues as weaknesses that could be exploited, turning patriotism into a tool for treason. Chen revealed that she had been monitoring the recruitment efforts against Admiral Matthews for the past 6 months, using her position in naval intelligence to intercept communications and identify planned approaches. Her intervention had prevented him from being compromised, but it had also increased the risk to both of them. The conspirators now knew that someone within the intelligence community was working against them. The evidence showed that the conspiracy had been planning to expand their operations significantly, using the current international tensions as cover for increased arms trafficking and mercenary activities. They were positioning themselves to profit from a potential conflict while simultaneously working to ensure that such a conflict would occur. It was a strategy of manufactured crisis that put millions of lives at risk for financial gain. Admiral Matthews looked up from the documents to find Chen watching him with an expression that mixed hope and desperation. She had risked everything to gather this evidence and had survived multiple attempts on her life to present it to someone with the authority to act. But she also understood that asking him to help meant asking him to sign his own death warrant. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast, and its tentacles reached so deep into the military hierarchy, that exposure would require extraordinary measures. Traditional channels of investigation and prosecution would be compromised by the very people they were trying to expose. They would need to work outside normal procedures, using methods that would technically violate their oaths of office, even as they served the deeper principles those oaths represented. Chen pulled out a secure communication device and showed Matthews encrypted messages from FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a federal prosecutor who had been building a parallel investigation into defense contractor fraud. Torres had been trying to gather evidence against the same people, but from the civilian side of the operation. She needed military witnesses and access to classified records to complete her case. The plan Chen outlined was dangerous and complex. They would need to coordinate with Torres and her team to simultaneously gather additional evidence, secure the testimony of other military witnesses, and prepare for the inevitable counterattack that would come once the conspirators realized they had been exposed. The operation would require absolute secrecy and perfect timing. Matthews studied the communication logs between Chen and Agent Torres, noting the elaborate security protocols they had established to avoid detection. Every message was encrypted, transmitted through multiple relay points, and verified through codes that changed daily. The level of operational security required suggested that the threat from the conspiracy was immediate and lethal. Chen explained that Torres had identified safe houses where they could meet with other witnesses and coordinate their investigation. But reaching these locations would require leaving the base through unofficial channels, using routes and timing that would avoid the surveillance network the conspirators had established. They would be operating like resistance fighters in occupied territory. The weight of decision seemed to press the air from the room as Admiral Matthews contemplated the choice before him. He could return the documents to Chen and pretend this conversation had never happened, continuing his career with the comfortable ignorance that had protected him for 40 years. Or he could commit himself to a course of action that would almost certainly end his military service, and quite possibly his life. Chen waited patiently as he wrestled with the implications, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. She had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, but for him, the revelation was sudden and overwhelming. Yet she also knew that time was running out, the conspirators were planning something significant, and the window for stopping them was closing rapidly. Outside the medical bay, the afternoon was giving way to evening, and the base was beginning to quiet down as the day shift ended. Soon they would need to make a decision about how to proceed, and that decision would determine not only their own fates, but potentially the fate of countless other people whose lives hung in the balance of this conspiracy. Admiral Matthews looked at the evidence spread before him, then at the young woman who had risked everything to gather it. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own values, the principles that had guided him through 4 decades of military service. The choice wasn't really between safety and danger. It was between honor and complicity, between serving his country and serving the institution that had been corrupted by traitors. Chen began to gather the documents, preparing to secure them before they left the medical bay. Every piece of evidence would need to be copied and hidden in multiple locations before they could begin the dangerous work of coordination with Agent Torres and the other investigators. The conspiracy had vast resources and would use every tool at their disposal to stop them. But they also had weaknesses that careful planning could exploit. The symbols carved into Chen's ribs had been intended as a record of criminal triumph, but they had become instead a roadmap to justice. Every mark represented not just a crime committed, but evidence that could be used to bring the perpetrators to account. The conspirators' attempt to turn her body into a monument to their impunity had instead created the key to their destruction. Admiral Matthews made his decision with the weight of 40 years of service behind him. He reached across the examination table and placed his hand over the documents, meeting Chen's eyes with steady resolve. The choice between institutional loyalty and moral duty had been made, and there would be no turning back from the path they were about to take together. The first step was securing the evidence and establishing communication with FBI Special Agent Torres. Chen revealed that she had hidden additional copies of the documents in safety deposit boxes across 3 different states, using false identities she had carefully constructed over years of preparation. The level of planning required for such precautions spoke to both her intelligence training and the very real danger they now faced together. Within hours of their meeting, Admiral Matthews began using his administrative authority to access classified records that corroborated Chen's evidence. Personnel files, budget allocations, and communication logs all supported her claims about the conspiracy's operations. But each query he made also created a digital footprint that would eventually be noticed by the very people they were investigating. The secure meeting with Agent Torres took place in a hotel room 200 miles from the naval base, reached through a complex series of vehicle changes and counter-surveillance measures that Chen had learned during her intelligence training. Torres proved to be a sharp-eyed federal prosecutor in her early 40s, with 15 years of experience investigating organized crime and government corruption. Torres laid out the federal investigation's findings, which complemented Chen's evidence perfectly. The FBI had been tracking financial irregularities in defense contractor payments for 3 years, following a money trail that led to the same network of shell companies and offshore accounts that Chen had identified. But they lacked the military insider knowledge needed to understand the operational details of the conspiracy. The meeting revealed that the conspiracy was even larger than Chen had realized. Torres showed them evidence of coordination between the American conspirators and similar networks in at least 6 other countries. They were part of an international arms trafficking operation that was destabilizing entire regions while generating billions of dollars in illegal profits. Admiral Matthews provided Torres with access codes and administrative protocols that allowed the FBI to monitor military communications without alerting the conspirators to the investigation. This breakthrough gave the federal team real-time intelligence about planned operations, including the massive arms shipment that Chen's scars had revealed was scheduled for the following month. The investigation revealed that General Morrison was planning to retire from the military and disappear to a country without extradition treaties, taking with him classified information worth millions of dollars to foreign intelligence services. His departure would also trigger the destruction of evidence and the elimination of witnesses, including Chen and anyone else who posed a threat to the conspiracy's security. Chen's intelligence contacts provided crucial information about the conspiracy's security protocols and communication methods. The group used military-grade encryption and counter-surveillance techniques that made them extremely difficult to monitor. That their reliance on military personnel and resources also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by investigators who understood those systems. The plan to expose the conspiracy required extraordinary coordination between military and civilian law enforcement agencies. Torres assembled a task force that included agents from the FBI, Treasury Department, and Naval Criminal Investigative Service, all operating under the strictest security protocols to prevent leaks that would warn the conspirators. Admiral Matthews used his position to quietly transfer trusted personnel to key positions where they could monitor and document the conspiracy's activities. Each transfer was justified through normal administrative channels, but the net effect was to place loyal eyes and ears throughout the network's operational structure. The investigation faced its first major test when Morrison attempted to recruit Matthews directly into the conspiracy, using a carefully orchestrated approach that began with informal social contact and gradually escalated to explicit offers of financial benefit. Matthews allowed the recruitment to proceed while recording every interaction, providing Torres with evidence of active corruption at the highest levels. Chen's role became even more dangerous as she was tasked with maintaining her cover while gathering evidence about the conspiracy's international connections. Her intelligence assignments gave her access to communications between the American conspirators and their foreign partners, revealing the global scope of the arms trafficking network. The evidence showed that weapons originally purchased by the American military were being sold to rebel groups, terrorist organizations, and foreign governments without any oversight or accountability. The conspirators had essentially turned the Pentagon's procurement system into a private arms dealing operation that was fueling conflicts around the world. Torres's investigation uncovered evidence that several recent international incidents, including attacks on American bases overseas, had been carried out using weapons that were supposed to be in American military inventories. The conspirators were literally selling the tools that were being used to kill American soldiers, creating demand for their products through the chaos they generated. Admiral Matthews discovered that his own base had been used as a transit point for illegal arms shipments on at least 6 occasions over the past 2 years. Equipment that was supposed to be destroyed or returned to depot had instead been diverted to the conspiracy's distribution network. The discovery forced him to confront the extent to which he had been unknowingly complicit in the operation. The psychological toll of the investigation began to show on all participants. Chen's careful emotional control started to crack as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, revealing not just the murder of her parents but a systematic betrayal of everything they had died trying to protect. Matthew struggled with the realization that his entire career had been built within an institution that had been corrupted at its highest levels. Agent Torres provided security details for both Chen and Matthews as the investigation progressed, understanding that their exposure would almost certainly trigger assassination attempts. The protection required elaborate cover stories and careful coordination with base security, all while maintaining the appearance of normal military operations. The breakthrough came when Chen's intelligence work identified a planned meeting between Morrison and representatives of a foreign intelligence service. The meeting would provide the final evidence needed to prove treason charges, but monitoring it would require resources and coordination that pushed the investigation to its operational limits. The operation to surveil Morrison's meeting required the cooperation of intelligence agencies from multiple countries, all coordinated through back channels that bypassed normal diplomatic protocols. Torres worked with international law enforcement contacts, while Matthews provided military intelligence support through unofficial networks. Chen volunteered to conduct the surveillance operation personally, using her intelligence training and language skills to monitor the meeting without detection. The assignment was extraordinarily dangerous, as Morrison's security protocols included counter-surveillance measures that could expose her presence and trigger immediate retaliation. The meeting took place in a private residence in a European capital, with participants arriving through carefully choreographed security procedures designed to prevent exactly the kind of surveillance Chen was attempting. She spent 3 days in position documenting conversations and photographing documents that proved the conspiracy's coordination with hostile foreign powers. The intelligence gathered during the surveillance operation provided the final pieces of evidence needed to bring formal charges against the entire conspiracy. But it also revealed that Morrison was aware of the investigation and was accelerating his timeline for destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. Admiral Matthews received an urgent communication from Chen indicating that her cover had been compromised during the surveillance operation. Morrison's security team had identified her presence and were actively hunting her through the city. She needed immediate extraction, but any official rescue operation would expose the investigation and warn the other conspirators. The crisis forced Matthews to choose between Chen's safety and the integrity of the investigation. Rescuing her would require using military resources in unauthorized ways that would certainly end his career and possibly compromise the evidence they had gathered. But allowing her to be captured would mean losing not only a key witness, but someone he had come to respect as the embodiment of everything honorable about military service. Torres coordinated with her international contacts to provide Chen with an escape route that avoided both official channels and Morrison's security network. The extraction required split-second timing and the cooperation of law enforcement agencies that were officially unaware of each other's involvement in the operation. Chen's escape from the surveillance site became a running battle through the narrow streets of the old city, with Morrison's operatives in pursuit and Torres's allies providing cover and misdirection. The chase lasted 6 hours and ended only when Chen reached the sanctuary of an American embassy, protected by diplomatic immunity that even Morrison couldn't violate directly. The successful extraction of evidence from Morrison's meeting provided the final proof needed to bring charges against the entire conspiracy. But it also triggered a desperate counterattack as the conspirators realized that their operation had been completely exposed and their only hope of escape lay in eliminating everyone who could testify against them. Admiral Matthews returned to his base to find that Morrison had activated sleeper agents throughout the military hierarchy, people who had been compromised by the conspiracy and were now being called upon to protect it at any cost. The investigation had become an active conflict between competing factions within the military itself. The final phase of the operation would require extraordinary courage from everyone involved, as they prepared to present evidence that would shatter the public's faith in military institutions, while simultaneously defending themselves against assassination attempts by people who had sworn the same oath of service they had taken. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest, with the fate of American democracy hanging in the balance. The final confrontation began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when federal agents simultaneously raided 17 locations across 5 states, executing search warrants that Agent Torres had spent weeks carefully preparing. Admiral Matthews watched from his office as FBI teams descended on the naval base, their movements coordinated with military police who had been secretly briefed on the operation. General Morrison's arrest took place in his Pentagon office, where agents found him attempting to destroy classified documents related to the arms trafficking operation. The sight of a 3-star general being led away in handcuffs sent shockwaves through the military establishment, but it was only the beginning of the revelations that would emerge over the following weeks. Chen stood beside Admiral Matthews as they watched the coordinated arrests through secure video feeds provided by Agent Torres. 23 military officers, 6 defense contractors, and an unknown number of foreign operatives were taken into custody, in what prosecutors would later describe as the largest military corruption case in American history. The evidence gathered during the investigation filled over 40,000 pages of documents and included financial records, communication intercepts, witness statements, and physical evidence that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy's operations. Chen's scarred ribs had provided the roadmap, but the investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise that exceeded even her worst fears about its scope and influence. The trials that followed would last for 3 years and revealed details that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. The conspiracy had been responsible for destabilizing governments in 12 countries, facilitating arms sales that led to an estimated 250,000 deaths and stealing over $2 billion from American military budgets. The human cost of their crimes was incalculable. General Morrison attempted to negotiate a plea bargain by offering to provide information about international connections to the arms trafficking network, but Agent Torres and her team had already gathered enough evidence to pursue prosecutions without his cooperation, and his offers were rejected. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Admiral Matthews faced his own legal challenges as prosecutors determined the extent of his unknowing involvement in the conspiracy's operations. His cooperation with the investigation and his role in exposing the crimes ultimately resulted in a reprimand and early retirement, but he avoided criminal charges. The career he had built over 40 years was over, but his conscience was clear. Chen's testimony during the trials was devastating to the defense, as she methodically explained how each scar on her body corresponded to specific criminal operations. The jury listened in horrified silence as she described 20 years of survival, investigation, and the systematic torture that had been intended to silence her but had instead provided crucial evidence. The international implications of the case led to diplomatic crises with several allied nations whose officials had been compromised by the conspiracy. Arms control agreements had to be renegotiated, intelligence sharing protocols were completely overhauled, and military procurement procedures underwent the most comprehensive reform in decades. Chen's survival had prevented what prosecutors believed would have been the conspiracy's final operation: the sale of advanced missile technology to a hostile foreign power in exchange for a payment large enough to fund the conspirators' permanent relocation to countries without extradition treaties. Her investigation had literally prevented an act of treason that could have shifted the global balance of power. The aftermath of the trials brought unexpected recognition for Chen, who was awarded the Medal of Honor for her courage in exposing the conspiracy despite decades of threats to her life. But she declined most public appearances, preferring to continue her naval service in intelligence positions, where her experience could help prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. Admiral Matthews used his forced retirement to write a comprehensive report on the institutional failures that had allowed the conspiracy to operate for decades. His recommendations for reform were adopted by the Pentagon and became the foundation for new oversight procedures designed to prevent the systematic corruption of military institutions. Agent Torres was promoted to lead a new federal task force dedicated to investigating corruption within military and intelligence agencies. The success of the arms trafficking investigation had demonstrated the need for specialized expertise in cases involving national security crimes, and her team became the model for similar units in other federal agencies. The house where Chan had hidden during her childhood, moving from one foster family to another, was purchased by a veterans organization and converted into a safe house for military whistleblowers who faced retaliation for reporting corruption and abuse. Chan anonymously funded the operation through proceeds from a book deal for her story. Years later, Chen would reflect on the moment when she first lifted her shirt to show Admiral Matthews the scars that had documented 2 decades of criminal operations. That single act of revelation had required more courage than any combat mission, because it meant abandoning the careful anonymity that had kept her alive and trusting that someone in authority would choose justice over institutional loyalty. The scars themselves faded over time, becoming pale reminders of the ordeal that had shaped her life. But the symbols carved into her ribs had served their purpose, providing the evidence needed to bring justice to the people who had murdered her parents and countless others. What had been intended as a monument to the conspiracy's impunity had become instead the instrument of their destruction. Admiral Matthews kept in touch with Chen through occasional letters, following her continued service and gradual healing from the trauma that had defined her early life. Their shared experience had created a bond that transcended normal military relationships, the connection between two people who had risked everything to defend principles larger than their own safety. The conspiracy's network had been so extensive that its complete dismantling took nearly 5 years. Shell companies were dissolved, offshore accounts were seized, and international arrest warrants were issued for foreign operatives who had fled to countries beyond American jurisdiction. The financial recovery alone exceeded $800 million. Chen eventually transferred to a teaching position at the Naval Academy, where she developed new curricula on ethics and integrity in military service. Her classes were among the most popular at the Academy, as cadets recognized that they were learning from someone who had proven the practical importance of moral courage under the most extreme circumstances. Their case became a landmark in military justice, establishing precedents for investigating and prosecuting corruption that involved classified operations and foreign intelligence services. Law schools taught courses based on the investigation techniques developed by Torres and her team, and the case study became required reading for military officers at all levels. Chen's story was eventually declassified and became the subject of congressional hearings on military procurement oversight and foreign influence operations. The testimony revealed details about the conspiracy that had been kept secret during the trials for national security reasons, showing that the corruption had been even more extensive than the public had realized. The memorial service for Chen's parents, delayed for more than 20 years by the need for secrecy during the investigation, finally took place at Arlington National Cemetery. Admiral Matthews delivered the eulogy, honoring Captain David Chen's sacrifice and the courage of a family that had paid the ultimate price for refusing to remain silent in the face of corruption. Chen stood at her parents' gravesite as the honor guard folded the flag that had covered their symbolic casket. The scars on her ribs no longer ached as they once had, and the nightmares that had haunted her sleep for decades had finally begun to fade. Justice had been achieved, but more importantly, the principles her parents had died defending had been vindicated. The base where Admiral Matthews had commanded during the investigation was renamed in honor of Captain David Chen, with a memorial garden dedicated to military personnel who had sacrificed their lives to expose corruption and abuse within their own institutions. Chen visited the memorial once each year, bringing flowers for parents she barely remembered but whose courage had shaped every decision of her adult life. The final chapter of the story was written not in courtrooms or congressional hearings, but in the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and honor preserved. Chen had survived not just the physical attacks against her life, but the more subtle corruption that threatened to destroy faith in the institutions she served. Her scars had become symbols not of victimization, but of resilience and the ultimate triumph of truth over power. Years later, when young officers asked Chen about her experience, she would tell them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when principles were at stake. The marks on her body had been intended to silence her, but they had instead become her voice, speaking truth to power with an authority that no amount of rank or influence could challenge. The conspiracy that had murdered her parents and terrorized her throughout her youth was finally destroyed, its perpetrators imprisoned or dead, its networks dismantled, and its crimes exposed to the light of justice. Chen had proven that even the most powerful criminal organizations could be defeated by the determined efforts of individuals who refused to be silenced by intimidation or corrupted by compromise. The story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen and Admiral Harrison Matthews became a testament to the enduring power of moral courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Their willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice had not only brought criminals to account, but had restored faith in the possibility that good could triumph over evil when people of conscience chose to act. The scars that had documented decades of crime had ultimately written a story of redemption and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.